agree with me that the plan to increase the capacity of the Dakota Access Pipeline from 570,000 barrels per day to 1.1 million barrels per day, that increase in volume, it will increase the negative impacts that would result from any spill or leak from the pipeline or pipeline facility. Do you agree with that?
I do not.
You put little under twice the amount of oil into a pipeline, and you're telling me that that will not increase the amount of oil released in a spill or a leak?
It may, but it may not.
Will putting more oil into the pipeline decrease the amount of oil that leaks or spills if there's an incident?
It could.
Yeah, and the capacity expansion that we're talking about from 570,000 barrels a day to 1.1 million barrels per day, that will increase the worst case scenario spill from the Dakota Access Pipeline, correct?
For the facility response plan that you're asking about, it will not.
And you're telling me that it's not going to increase the worst case scenario or a leak or a spill from the pipeline or its facilities?
You specifically asked the question whether it would increase the worst case discharge calculated in the FRP, and I answered that it would not.
Yeah, so actually I didn't, and I'm going to get to worst case discharge. I'm talking about something different. The worst case scenario. I know what the worst case discharge is. We're going to walk through that. And your answer is the same. You double the amount of oil through the pipeline, and the worst case scenario here does not get any worse. That's your testimony.
I'm not aware of, you're making up a hypothetical situation that I can't comment on.
4 factors. First one is detection time. We've talked about that, right?
Yes.
Second factor is time to shut down the pipeline.
Yes.
Obviously, that's a factor because until you shut down the pipeline, oil is still flowing and it may be spilling, it may be leaking, correct?
Correct.
The third is you multiply that by the maximum flow rate, correct?
The timing, yes, the flow rate comes into the calculation.
Right.
Yes.
And that flow rate, I believe Mr. Fry testified, will go up because of the proposed increase in capacity of this pipeline from 570 to 1.1 million. Is that correct?
Correct.
And there is currently a worst-case discharge analysis on the Dakota Access Pipeline at 570K barrels per day, right? That exists.
Correct.
Has there been a worst-case discharge analysis done on the projected expansion to 1.1 million barrels per day?
Not as of yet, but once again, as I indicated, I anticipate that there will be no increase in the worst-case discharge.
So when I asked you if the worst-case discharge was going to be higher because we're 570 to 1.1 million, you said no, but now you're telling me you haven't even done that math yet. Is that what I understand?
Yeah, I think it's fair to help answer your question for the commission that the worst-case discharge is the discharge of a tank, which has a significantly greater volume than that of the pipeline.
And is there a separate worst-case discharge analysis for the pipeline as opposed to the tanks in the FRP?
There is only one worst-case discharge for an FRP.
So let's go back to the four components of the worst-case discharge analysis. You've got you've got detection time, correct?
Correct.
Objection. I mean, we're getting into. Objection. We're getting into an area of PHMSA. It's clear that this commission cannot, get into this regulation because it's preempted by federal regulation. And beyond that, a lot of these questions have already been answered.
Well, Mr. Purdon, let me take the second part first. I was told when I was questioning Mr. Fry, and wanted to get into this, that this was the witness to answer my questions, so I don't think they've been answered. And secondly, the commission here is not to determine, the commission's task is not necessarily to determine whether or not federal regs have been followed. They're a floor. The issue before the commission is whether or not this is going to have a minimal adverse impact on the environment and the people of North Dakota. And I would think the commission might want to know, how do they figure out the worst case discharge here? What does that look like? How do they do that? And that might be relevant to their eventual determination.
But what Mr. Purdon is trying to do is he's trying to get this witness to admit that the worst case discharge is going to change because the volume is going to go from 570,000 barrels a day to 1.1 million barrels a day. And Mr. Stamm has already answered that question. He said it will not change. And Mr. Purdon continues to try to get him to change his mind.
He's also said he hasn't done the math yet, so
Okay,
I'd like
let's
to
hold
parse that.
on a second here. Mr. Pelham, do you have any comment as to the jurisdiction of the Public Service Commission?
I think in this hearing, the commission has the jurisdiction as set by statute, which includes analysis as to whether or not the proposed facilities will have a minimal adverse impact on the environment and the welfare of the citizens of the state of North Dakota. Whether or not the interplay of federal regulations may or may not apply in the ultimate application is not the question here, I don't think. But I think that the questions can be asked and they should be answered so that the commission can evaluate it.
The point I'm trying to make, and I don't think it's controversial, is that when you nearly double the flow of oil through the pipeline, and there is, God forbid, a spill or a leak on the pipeline itself, not on a facility, not on a tank, but on the pipeline itself, and you've doubled the capacity, you are going to increase the amount of oil that goes into the ground or the water if that happens. Is that correct?
I'm sorry. I'm not trying to be controversial. And I believe you asked the question previously, and my statement was that you asked if it would increase, and I said, not necessarily.
But my greatest fear isn't that we're going to experience a pipeline leak over that river. My greatest fear is that my children or my grandchildren are going to experience that. And I want my children, because I know they're listening to me, to have the same courage that I have to be here with you. Because courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is the ability to overcome that emotion. I'm here today because 7 generations ago, my ancestors prayed about us. And I'm also here to tell you that we're praying for our future. We're praying for our grandchildren.